Let me just get your reaction to this. This was a war that was ratcheting up before we got that Supreme Court decision on the Voting Rights Act, before we got this news from the Virginia Supreme Court. Where do you see things going from here? It does seem like we could see an America where there are no contested districts across these great United States.
Well, I think, David, we're in the early innings of what will probably become a redistricting war. And I think we've gotten here because of the White House's, the Republican parties, and Donald Trump's concerns about how the midterms were taking shape. And it's unfortunate because I don't think politicians of either party want to inhabit a Congress in which lines are routinely redrawn midterm. One, at a practical level, it distracts all of them from doing the legislative work they go to Washington to do. Secondly, I think it effectively undermines democracy. The framers of the Constitution didn't envision districts at all, and there's a good reason to have them, especially because they also didn't envision the population of the United States booming and spreading in the way it has. And districts essentially allow the states to be carved up in a way in which a representative from each state has a manageable district to represent. What's happened now is they become a political football. They used to be drawn, every decade after the census was taken. The second they become a political tool, then the maps become suspect, whichever party is finagling with them. And the politically correct term for finagle is gerrymander. And so it raises this issue, apart from machinery and the machinations around it, does it represent a democratic process? Are the voters being heard? Are they being effectively represented? And if they're not, that's a problem. And if redistricting has become weaponized, then it poisons, I think, the voting process. And I think there's going to be much more of this in store. And I don't think either party will ultimately be happy with it.
That's what I was just going to ask you, is this mutually assured destruction? My mother always said 2 wrongs don't make a right. And for a while, that seemed to be,
Mother's Day, I should
when
say.
they,
yes.
Michelle Obama, when they go low, we go high. But there has been a sea change, and that's due to pressure both from Democratic voters to want to see Democratic lawmakers take action. But also, they're telling us they feel like they kind of had to do something. But it seems like this could be a short-term game for long-term damage to both parties and to the political system as a whole.
I think that's exactly right. The Democrats didn't set this in motion, at least in the most recent iteration. Trump did, and for expressly political reasons. And that's poisonous. And I do think it's a threat to democracy. And even if we come out of this sort of revisiting this, stepping back, curing some of the illness that's been bled into the system, I think it's still damaging. And the Constitution envisioned trying to resolve this tension between mob rule, majority rule, and responsible elected officials. And a lot of those checks and balances in the Trump era, whether it's the separation of powers at the federal level or how voting occurs at the state level, have all been tossed up in the air in a way that's really very damaging. And I think people who care about the rule of law, a democracy, and efficient electoral processes should be alarmed.
Tim, last question here, a bit of a curveball, but we did see Abigail Spanberger, the governor of Virginia, signing this legislation into law this week, the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact. A number of other jurisdictions have done this as well. And I'm curious how you see this, coloring that conversation about the Electoral College, whether we should still have it in this day and age, if you think that this is going to add grist to that movement to get away from it.
Well, the Electoral College is the flip side of the districting issue. It was invented by the framers, again, to prevent mob rule, to make sure that each state had an effective presence in the federal government, and that you wouldn't have extremes of either side forcing poor outcomes. But again, they didn't envision the world we've become. Now, if the GOP and Trump were consistent on this, if they're revisiting redistricting, they should also be happy to revisit the structure of the Electoral College. But somehow, mysteriously, there's no conversation going on the Republican side about revisiting what the Electoral College does and how it functions. And Classic conservatism preserves institutions because institutions over time have shown they have value to a society. So the conservative argument for the Electoral College would be preserve it in its form because it's proved to be worthwhile. But if that's the case, then they shouldn't be messing at all with districts.